Alrighty, so as you are reviewing for your quiz over sections 4.8 to 4.10, I promised you the video that would walk us through how to solve each of the problems from your review assignment. So page 321, numbers 38 to 48. Numbers 38 to 41 all correspond to section 4.8, which involves using our quadratic formula and the discriminant. So our instructions for 38, 39, and 40 are to solve using the quadratic formula. So in number 38, the first thing we want to do is pick out what is our A value, what's our B, and what is our C. So remember, your A is your leading coefficient, the coefficient of x squared, B is the coefficient of x, and C is your constant. So our quadratic formula is x equals negative b, so negative 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I like to do as much either by hand or in my head as possible and then go to my graphing calculator if I even need to. So I would look at this and I would say, oh, okay, I can do 4 squared and I can do negative 4 times 1 times negative 3. So now I'll have x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 4 squared is 16, and then negative 4 times 1 times negative 3 is positive 12. All over 2 times 1, which is just 2. And then again, simplifying as much as possible, 16 plus 12 under the radical, I'm going to have 28. So x equals negative 4 plus or minus radical 28 all over 2. Now, the square root of 28, we are able to break some of that out of jail. So our factors of 28 include 4 and 7. 4 is a perfect square, so I break down radical 28 into negative 4 plus or minus 2 root 7 all over 2. Now, notice from all of these terms, I have a 4, a 2, and a 2. I can divide everything by 2. So I have x equals negative 2 plus or minus 1 root 7 all over 1, or better yet, just negative 2 plus or minus root 7. And there are our answers. Number 39, the first thing that we need to do before we can pick out A, B, and C is to get 0 on one side of my equation. So I'm going to go ahead and add 6x and add 1. So really that's going to become 9x squared plus 6x plus 1 equals 0. So this time around my A is 9, B is going to be positive 6, C is positive 1. So I have x equals negative b, negative 6, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So I have x equals negative 6 plus or minus 6 squared is 36. And then negative 4 times 9 times 1 is negative 36. This will be interesting. All over 2 times 9 is 18. Now I say this is interesting because under my radical I have 0. So remember that the term that you get under the radical is also called your discriminant. So our discriminant for this, b squared minus 4ac, is 0. When our discriminant is equal to 0, we know automatically that we are going to have one real solution. So that's what we'll expect going forward when we solve. So I'll have x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 0, which is just 0, all over 18. And then we reduce as much as possible. I can take 6 out of top and bottom. X equals negative 1/3. Final answer. Number 40, again, I need to get 0 on one side. I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So I have 6x squared minus 8x plus 3 equals 0. My A is going to be positive 6, B is negative 8, C is positive 3. So I have x equals negative b, okay? Negative 8 would give you a positive 8. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, negative 8 quantity squared. We'll keep in mind whether that's going to be positive or negative here in a second. Minus 4ac all over 2a. So when I square negative 8, don't forget that you're taking negative 8 times negative 8. When you take a negative number and you square it, it will always be positive. So I have 8 plus or minus the square root of positive 64. And then negative 4 times 6 times 3. 4 times 6 is 24, times 3 is 72. So minus 72 all over 12. Now again, looking at our discriminant, just our numbers under the radical, 64 minus 72 is going to give me a negative 8. So that means I'm going to have two imaginary solutions. So I'll have x equals 8 plus or minus the square root of negative 8 all over 12. Don't forget, when you have the square root of a negative, we like to break it out of jail immediately. So I'm going to call that 8 plus or minus I radical 8 over 12. But again, radical 8 isn't something that we'd like to keep around because we are able to take a 4 out of that, break it out of jail. So then I'd have 8 plus or minus 2I root 2 all over 12. Again, I've got, even number, even number, even number. So I need to reduce. So I have x equals 4 plus or minus I root 2 all over 6. Lastly, from this section, we have number 41, which says, you've got a volleyball player who spikes a ball 9 feet above ground with an initial velocity of negative 40 feet per second. The ball falls to the ground. I want to know how long the ball is in the air, or how long does it take. For this problem, we need to remember our formula. H equals negative 16t squared plus v naught t plus h naught, where the first h is your final height, your v naught is your initial velocity, and h naught is your initial height. Well, if I want my ball to fall to the ground, that means I need the height to be 0. So 0 equals negative 16t squared plus v naught, initial velocity, negative 40 feet per second. So plus negative 40t, or you could just have minus 40t, plus an initial height of 9 feet. And then this is something I would go through and I would solve. So I would use the quadratic formula, of course. So then I'd have x equals, well, what's a, what's b, what's c? A is going to be negative 16, b is negative 40, c is positive 9. So as I'm solving, I'm going to go ahead and take x equals negative b, so positive 40 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, 2 times negative 16. So again, I'm going to go ahead and continue to reduce and simplify, make it look slightly better, and then eventually I will plug it into my graphing calculator so that I get an answer that actually makes sense. So I have x equals 40 plus or minus the square root of negative 40 quantity squared gets me positive 1600, and then negative 4 times negative 16 is 64 times 9. 4 times 9 is 36. 54, 57, 576. All over 2 times negative 16, negative 32. And I keep going. X equals 40 plus or minus the square root of, let's see, plus 1600, 671, 2176. This will be fun. All over negative 32. So now, as we're going through and we're solving, don't forget we are technically going to get 2 answers, but we don't want to give 2 answers because our second one won't make sense, right? If we are dealing with time, then we can't have a negative answer. So we would go through, we would solve, and we would get a final answer for our time. When we plug these into our graphing calculator, so we have, or just any calculator for that matter, we have x equals 40 plus radical 2176 over negative 32, and 40 minus the square root of 2176 over negative 32. When we plug the first guy into our calculator, we get a negative 2.71-ish. Plugging the second one in, we get about 0.21. Now remember, these are both in terms of seconds, so I don't want my negative answer. That makes no sense. So my final answer is about 0.21 seconds. Now go ahead and watch the next video to figure out how we work through the problems related to section 4.9.